first talk of the year. I don't know if you were here last year for Sebastiano's talk, exactly a year ago. So I mentioned this anecdote last time, but I'm happy to mention it again. So if I
can retell it.
Yes, you can retell it as well. But if you don't know, as I mentioned last time, it's this guy's fault if I'm doing what I'm doing, if you believe in imprinting, because the first ever scientific seminar that I attended was about their work. It was almost exactly 17 years ago, I believe, January 2003. That makes all of us feel old. And it was a talk about their work on crawling. So it's great to have you here. So I was imprinted with how cool is studying the web and graphs and so on. So today is going to talk about degeneracy and pathological cases of using Kendall'S assortativity.
Actually, Kendall is the solution.
Kendall is the
Newman
solution.
what is the one that's Yes, Spearman is.
Okay, so without any further ado, thanks everyone for coming today, and let's have Sebastiano's talk.
Okay, so this dot work with Paolo Boldi, my long-time author, and it will be pretty brief. I mean, the takeaway from this talk should be that there are some pathologies you must be aware if you're measuring assortativity, degree assortativity using this standard, I mean, Newman's definition that people actually uses. And we went, we did some work on pathological example and on corrections to try to understand exactly, where are the problems and how you can fix them. So there is no deep math. There are some pathology, some solutions, and a lot of open questions. And thanks again for having me in this completely weird day just before the retreat. As I said, I was squeezed between soda and having to teach very soon. So, okay. Assortativity is a general concept that would be the tendency of the node of a network to be linked with a like node by some measure. That could be anything, any kind of metadata, like men often link with men and women with women or anything. But usually when one speaks of assortativity in a graph without any other associated metadata, the thing you have in mind is degree assortativity. So essentially you ask if people that have many friends are usually linked with people with many friends, few friends with few friends, or the opposite happens. Okay, and the way in which this was introduced by Newman in a very famous, very quoted paper, essentially is to take the Pearson correlation between the standard statistical correlation between the two lists of degrees at the end of edges. So essentially, you list all the edges of a graph, okay, and for each edge you have two numbers, the number at one end and the other number at the other end. So you have two lists of numbers and you can measure the correlation. And this is what is done in the paper. And then there are billions of different ways of writing down this definition and computing. In particular, there is a formula that gives you linear time algorithm in the number of edges, which makes it attractive even for fairly large networks. Okay. This is for undirected networks. Of course, if you have directed networks, you have many types because you can try to look if at the end of an arc, the in degree is correlated to in degree, the out degree is correlated to the out degree, the in degree is correlated to the out degree, or the out degree is correlated to the in degree. And so there are basically four types. For instance, in the web, you would expect the minus correlation being slightly disassortative because sites that are not very important and have a very fairly low in degree tend to link important sites because we all link important sites. So you would expect something a little bit unassortative. In general, one saying, it's not a totally established nomenclature, but disassortative is opposite. So many links to few, okay? Unassortative, big mix, nobody understands, and assortative with assortativity is, people with a lot of links link to people with a lot of links. And of course, being a correlation goes from -1, disassortative, 0, unassortative, and 1, assortative. Okay, there is a paper that by Litvak and van der Hofstad in Physical Review in 2013 that was posing a major problem that is essentially if you have a large network with a heavy tail, in fact it was a power law in the paper, but you can extend it a little bit. Basically in a vast range of models of this kind, in the limit, when the network goes to infinity, you always have a positive value. You cannot get non-assortativity. Usually you get 0, and the reason is that, I mean, very vaguely, but in the formula there is a cube at the denominator, a cube of the degrees, a sum of cubes of the degrees. When the network is very large and the tail is very fat, this cube kills completely. There's a side effect that kills the formula and it goes to 0. Now, the point is that most of the time this thing has been applied, and the example are like hundreds of nodes. Okay, but when you go to hundreds of millions or billions of nodes, this effect starts to be visible. In fact, in the paper they try on Wikipedia, and it's not so strong. One thing we wanted to do is, since we have software that is very optimized and so on, we wanted to try this on much larger networks in the order of billions of edges or hundreds of billions of edges. We will see that going beyond billions of edges, it's a bit complicated, not for this kind of correlation, but Kendall correlation. But wanted to see whether there was,
one question I have is the problem really trying to create a global metric of assortativity? For example, there's been some recent work in...
Yeah, this is when you do the Newman formula, the local assortativity, the work on local assortativity fix this kind of stuff. No. Here I'm talking, I mean, this is what people usually confuse. I don't know, I'm not quoting, I know there is some work on local assortativity that tries to circumvent this global size effect.
Right.
Here we're trying to find a global way to fix the problem rather than go, at least to lessen the problem rather than to try to do it locally.
Sure.
Okay, so one possible solution is to try other correlations, because this is not the only measure of correlation. And usually when you have this kind of effect based on size, switching to ranks helps. There is turning the list of numbers actually in the list of ranks. This immediately poses the problem of change of complexity, in the sense that if you want to derive ranks, you have to do sorting. And unless you are in some super happy situation like the different degrees are so few that you do count sort, this will be n log n, whereas m log m, where m is the number of edges, whereas for Pearson correlation, we can do just linear time in the number of edges. So this is something that, in fact, there are even more complicated arithmetic problems in some cases. Okay, so let me discuss briefly this example, which is not mine. This example in the paper by Nelly and Guido. So here we have two networks that are almost identical in the sense that, there is a bridge edge, G, which is split into here. And then you have a lot of edges coming in here, a lot of edges coming out here, a lot of edges coming out here, and a lot of edges coming out there. So if you look at this network, well, and we're going to look at the minus plus assortativity. Okay, so in degree versus out degree. And you can see that, for instance, before surprise. Okay, so like this has in degree 0 and point something out degree 1. This has very large in degree points and something with very low degree. This is very low degree points to something with a very high out degree. So essentially, this should be very, very disassortative, like negative. For this network, we can somehow decide in the sense that all these arcs are not well assorted, because it's 0 against this is 0 against a large number, and this is 1 against minus 1. Did I say right? Okay. And this is 1 against 0. But this edge has a lot of weight because it has a large in degree and a large out degree. So we could discuss whether this is actually unassorted intuitively. I mean, before going to the computation, whether this is assortative or unassortative. Certainly, it is not assortative because there are a very large number of edges that may grow arbitrarily that are not assortative. So what happens is weird in the sense that for any A larger than 1, if you consider this graph in which this number of nodes is an and this is n, so n and an, What happens is that this goes to 1 and this goes to 0. So not only this does not come out as disassortative, which is what you expect, goes to 0 because of the famous size effect that I was quoting in essentially the formula. But this one turns out to be very assortative, which is one of the possibilities. But essentially what's happening is that this single edge is driving completely the assortativity of the network, because all the other edges will tell you, no, this is not assortative. But since there is this, there are various cubes essentially and squares in the formula depending on the degree of at the two sides of G, you get this. Now, this is super weird because these networks are essentially identical. I mean, yeah, okay, we put something here in the middle, but we wouldn't expect to have such an enormous range of difference just because we had it here. This is a little in line with the work we did with axiom of centrality and rank monotonicity. We try to perturb a little bit the network, and we see if we see a very major effect that is usually a sign that there is some pathology in the network. Now, the nice thing is that if you instead do Spearman's law, you always get -1 on these networks. Given that, and here is we enter in a slightly muddy territory. When you do Spearman's law, you have to decide what you do for ties. So you do ranks, but if you have multiple degrees, you will have a lot of numbers in this list that are the same. So if you following the choice you have to solve the problem of ties, you get different values. One of the most reasonable choices is to use the same rank for all the ties, so the rank will not be from 0 to m, but from 0 to m minus the number of duplicates in the list. And what they show in the paper is that if you do Kendall'S tau, but they do the naive version, like the version concordancy minus discordancy, I'm going to discuss that, you get this value, which is really not what we want, because when A gets large, this goes to 0. There is a slight disassortativity, but it goes to 0. And so they conclude that, okay, we have, actually they're more fond of, because the guys in probability, to do randomization of the ties, which gives further different results. So our first notice was that if you use the right definition, you can definitely use Kendall'S tau. And okay, so I don't know how many people are familiar with the two definitions, 38, 45. Okay, let me briefly explain. So Kendall'S tau is a very famous measure of correlation. Essentially, you take two score vectors in which there are no ties. Initially, it was thought just for rankings, actually, not for scores, but then you can turn distinct vectors of distinct scores into a rank. And you call concordance a pair ij if the score for I and j in both scores are in the same order. So 3, 5, 7, 12. Okay. If instead they are in opposite order, you call it a discordance. And everything is either a discordance everything is either a concordance or a discordance because there are no ties. And Kendall'S tau in the original definition 38 is just the number of concordances minus the number of discordances divided by the overall number of pairs. So if the two ranks are exactly the same, you get all concordances and you have 1. If the ranks are exactly opposite, you get all discordances and you get -1, and 0 is somewhat uncorrelated or whatever. Now, people sometimes play, as they did in the paper, they use this and just skip ties, but this does not really work because if you consider ties not a concordance, you lose literally pieces. So there are two fixes. One is actually well known, and it's a good one, cross gamma, in which instead of doing concordances minus discordances divided pairs, you do concordances minus discordances divided by concordances plus discordances. So the fact that you make vanish the ties at the numerator and the denominator makes, in some way, this work. I have reason not to like Goodman cross gamma that I can talk about later. So what we actually tried was to use the second definition by Kendall, the 45 definition, which is, okay, this is sometimes called tau B, but it doesn't make any sense because it's a definition that comprises the handling of ties. And if you have no ties, it's exactly the previous definition. So let's say this is Kendall'S tau. So the idea actually comes from a paper. So Daniels, after Kendall published his paper in 38, writes a paper in which he shows that basically any kind of statistical correlation is cosine similarity if you remap the vector in an adequate space. But everything is cosine similarity. You just have to transform a little bit the vectors. And for Kendall'S tau, he suggests this. So call SGNR. So you have a score vector, okay? You take a larger vector, SGNR, who has n binomial two elements, essentially. So pair of indices, of distinct indices, I less than j. And in position ij, you have sign ri minus rj. So the vector is a quadratically larger vector that has one coordinate for each pair, and the coordinates are only 0 for ties, 1 for concordancy, -1 for discordancy. And then you say, okay, Kendall'S is just cosine similarity between these two vectors. And if you work out the math, it's exactly the previous definition. There is no difference. But now you can also put in stuff with ties, because it's a cosine similarity. It will be always between -1 and 1, but in some ways a more principled way of balancing the ties. One can discuss up to death whether good and cross gamma is better than this, but we have done a lot of work with this, and for us it works very well. Another way to see it, a little bit more poetic, but not totally precise, is that you're defining a kind of internal product that has this form. So you sum for every pair of indices the signum of this times the signum of this. This is a three-way signal function, okay? So -1, 0, 1. Now, this is not really an internal product because it's not linear, but you can kind of define a norm, and then you can kind of define this in the same form of cosine similarity, okay? Again, if you actually replace R and S with this SGN R vectors, it's just cosine similarities. But you can even see it in the standard format, I mean, without expanding the vector, by building this almost like internal product, you have this almost like norm. And the nice thing is that for this product and norm, Cauchy-Schwarz works. So this is between -1 and 1. Okay, so there are two ways of seeing the same idea, which is if you want to handle ties, you have to remap in a space in which you treat ties equally. I mean, in some systematic way. And if you use this, everything goes to -1, like Spearman rho in the specific for the example we've seen. So essentially, for us, this is the idea. This is why the title of the talk is the case of Kendall'S assortativity. This gives you a way to treat assortativity, handling the ties, with less, we hope, size effect, because we just worked out an example. Okay, and the results are coherent with a reasonable assumption using Spearman's rho. Okay, yeah.
So is there like a systematic difference between what you get with this formulation of the Kendall'S and the previous formulation, the Goodman-Kruskal version?
Okay, if I remember correctly, there is some work by Diaconis in which he bounds Goodman-Kruskal gamma and Kendall'S within, like, a factor of 1/2, 3/4. So the measures are, you say, not settled, sandwiched. So you can sandwich Kendall'S using Goodman-Kruskal gamma with certain coefficient and vice versa. Yeah.
Now, I'm not familiar with Kendall'S I mean, more familiar now that you've shown it to me. But I'm very familiar with, say, Spearman rank correlation. I would maybe claim is commonly used in many cases of correlation analysis besides Pearson correlation. How would I was recalling you were talking about Pearson correlation in your abstract, but how would you're using Spearman correlation in your abstract? So how would Spearman correlation behave? It would seem natural to use Spearman correlation instead.
So this is what I was saying. So if you do Spearman's rho, you get -1. Okay. So this is a kind of taste thing. So when you have a lot of ties with Spearman's rho, depending on how you handle the ties, you get different values.
I see.
Okay. Yeah. So you introduce a parameter.
Yeah.
Now, of course, choosing another correlation is introducing a parameter. But for us, I mean, it's a matter of taste and custom. I mean, we always use Kendall'S when you have to do this rank stuff. Yeah. So we wanted to see whether we could get a result compatible with a more meaningful tie handling in the case of Spearman's rho.
Yeah.
That's the other nice thing that I should say at the end, but is that Kendall'S is very easy to weight. in the sense that I had a paper about this in WWW a few years ago. This kind of internal product, you can make it into a weighted internal product. I mean, like a Hilbert space. And then you can have interesting ways to, you can have exchanges that are concordances that are more important than others. Okay. With Goodman-Kruskal gamma is a little bit complicated because ties literally disappear from the formula. So it's very easy to build example in which you have a tie that is super important and it counts nothing in the result because physically in the formula the tie is no longer there. It disappears. It's concordance. Whereas with Kendall tau, the tie is there. I mean, there is an internal product, and even if there is a tie, it counts. If you make it very, very important, it will lead to uncorrelation.
Just a clarifying question. Concordances where they have the same rank?
Yeah, concordance means, okay, so they are score vectors. So it means that in position, say, Ri, you have 3, Rj, you have 4. In position, no, let's do em pi, so they're not, and in position Si, you have square root of 2, in position Sj, square root of 5. So the order is the same, which means that if you were to sort the elements, the relative order, the rank of the two would be the same in both cases. Okay, so you want to, it's a way to measure the correlation that is independent of the magnitude, which is good in some cases and horribly bad in other cases. I have horror stories of both on both sides in several applications. But if you think that magnitude is like there are papers measuring convergence of PageRank in Kendall'S tau, because at that point, because the reasoning is if I'm using it for search engine, I'm really caring about the order in which stuff comes out. Of course, it's a very abstract thing because this is actually a signal that is fed into some complicated learning algorithm, so you don't want the rank, you actually want the number. But if you reason that way, you can try to, for instance, see how fast the PageRank converges in Kendall'S tau. So when pairs starts to change, at some point during the iteration, very few pairs change. At that point, you claim convergence, even if numerically maybe you're not so close to. Okay, so we are happy. This works nicely, and okay, let's see if it actually works in a minute. So this is the premise. Second problem. So while we're working at this, we will see in experiment very weird results, like super weird results, like unexplainable results. And after a while, we realize why. So the size effect is not the only pernicious problem of assortativity. There is a very, very strong tightly knit community effect. So the TKC effect is, the name was born with KITS, the Kleinberg ranking algorithm. Essentially, many ranking algorithms based on spectral ideas, so suffer from the fact that they are basically sensitive to local density. So if you have a very small set of nodes that is super connected, they can drive the score incredibly far, even if the network overall is very, very large. So, which was I said, intuitively, this is like says that you have a measure or a correlation or a score that is sensitive to density, to local density, but not to size. So a very small number of nodes that are extremely dense can do can do a lot of harm. In fact, the name was coined by Don Dempel in the work of Salsa, which is a kind of weighted version of HITS. I'm not giving you the details, but they were like the title of Salsa paper is like ranking and the TKC effect or something, because essentially they were trying to fix the fact that HITS the rank Kleinberg score is very sensitive. Another nice example that I always come out with is PageRank on the Hollywood co-starship graph. This is a classical example of, so you take EMDB, okay, maybe in 2018 is not the same, but I have the graph from 2012, you take EMDB, okay, and you make a graph in which you have everybody ever worked at Hollywood, and there is an edge if they worked in the same movie. So basically the graph is a superposition of clicks, because every movie is a click, and then okay. And then you can run PageRank on that. And you might have expectations of the result, but not exactly what you expect. So if you don't know, Ron Jeremy is a very famous, or now he's not working anymore, but porn actor. Okay. And okay, so we have a number of people that shouldn't be here. One is, okay, first of all, anybody that appears anywhere as himself is in EMDB marked as himself. So Hitler appears in an enormous number of documentaries and so on. So that might be reasonable. Ronald Reagan appears both as himself and not as himself, because, as you probably know, he was a Western film actor before doing the president. But the three this is all wrong, of course, but the 33 important cases are this one, because these two people, this is a cult director that has a very, very small clique of people, works always with them, and it's a ridiculously small area, but it's super dense. So this is his fetish actor. And porn is much smaller than Hollywood, but it's always the same people. So if you look at around Ron Jeremy, there's a super dense small part, which drives him to be the best actor by PageRank on the whole Hollywood graph, which doesn't make, of course, many sense. So this is an example of local density driving things in the wrong direction. But let's see here. So let me take these two graphs. So this is a click. This is an entire graph. If you don't like that it's disconnected, just take a long path in the middle. This is not important. But the point is that the left part is unassortative, and the right part is very, very, very assortative. There's nothing more assortative than a click. Okay? And, that should have appeared after. Okay. Anyway, so consider that I have P, red nodes, Q, blue nodes, and K, black nodes. Now, this part is unassortative as long as P is small of Q. So when you send this to infinity, as long as P is small of Q, Pearson assortativity goes to 0. And it's quite easy to see why, because these are nodes that are long links, and these are few links. Now, what we will do, we will add a click, but a very, very small click. So P red nodes, P square blue nodes, and P square root of P plus epsilon, square root of P, no. Root of P of the order 1/2 plus epsilon. So a little bit more than the square root of P. And when you send this to infinity, this is the assortativity you get, which means that you have a threshold effect. If epsilon is less than 1/2, goes to 0, well, as a half goes to 1/2, and then goes to 1. So what I'm saying is that a tightly knit community of order square root of order 4 of the network can drive a large assortative network to 1. Because this is very, very large and would go to 0 on its own. We add here something that is order of 4th root of the size of the network, because the network is basically size P squared. And this is basically size square root of P. So these are ridiculously small. I mean, 100 million, we're talking 1,000 versus 1,000 billion. Okay, so 4 times, okay? So this, so small, drives a completely unassortative network to a complete assortativity. Again, because there is this growth effect due to the,
So this is 1,000 versus 1 billion, but does it have to be 1,000 a click, or
no. Just I will show you a real life example in which it happens, and it's
like just a very
dense. It's sufficient, very dense. We do the analytical computation on this example, but we have real world example. I'm sure there is just a web crawl in which we got a gallery, and the gallery, everything is linked, and the effects are devastating.
So assortativity, people don't rank by assortativity, so that won't have this big impact. But we'll do the same thing to PageRank as well, like like you can manipulate PageRank by adding.
Well, no. Okay, that's a good question. Yes, I mean, if you have, I don't know if the size is the same, but if you have a super dense area, because PageRank is very local. I mean, after a few jumps, basically, you have no contribution. So if you have enough large, very dense network, you will get a higher score that you would expect, in the sense that the size of the click is not relevant. It's just the density that is relevant for PageRank. This is not the same with other scores like harmonic centrality, where size actually matters. Yes.
Oh, no, I'm just.
Okay, so let's try with Kendall. Maybe it's better. Okay. Okay, so we do the same. And interesting, this goes to 0 exactly with the same value. So the Pearson and the Kendall'S assortativity of this network are exactly the same. I mean, for every P and every Q. But you get the same transition for this, e to the 3/2, which means that you have the same threshold effect, but now you need the tight-knit community of this order, and this is reasonable. I mean, this is not the size of the network, but it's immensely larger. Okay, so not only Kendall'S DAO reduces the size effect that tends to zero everything, but also prevents title knit community for going too quickly towards one. Okay, because you need a much larger. Okay, you never show tables like this, but just to show you that we tried a lot of networks. Okay, so we decided to have a look at, basically we put out everything we have in our database. There are Twitter, there are several kinds of version of Wikipedia, DBLP, Hollywood construction graph, host graphs, top-level many graphs, Orkut, Twitter, blah, blah. And we tried, we implemented.
How many of them directed?
So I would say, I should have written this, I would say 4 or 5 are undirected, and most of them are directed, because most are Twitter, web, and Wikipedia. There are a few that are undirected, like Orkut, Hollywood co-starship graph, of course, is undirected, and DBLP is undirected, because it's the co-writing graph, it's not the quotation graph. Okay, so basically we try to, pesca strascico, how do you say that in
Good question.
when you cast large nets and you hope to catch some fish, but you have really no idea.
Trawling,
data
or
science.
dredging or something. I would assume dredging or.
Yeah. Okay, so you get this horrible thing, in which, however, there are a few items that are really, okay, the bold-faced one have a large gap, but I'll show you a picture about this. This is just to tell you, we compute all these numbers to see what was happening. And yes, there are some gaps here and there. Not always, in particular when you're unassortative for real, there is basically no difference between the values. But then when you try to look at them in a more graphical way, it becomes much more interesting. Okay, so this is the minus Pearson correlation. Now you see the dots, each dot is a network, and the size of the dot is the size of the network.
Just -1, meaning like you're looking only at the...
In degree correlation, and for undirected graph correlation, because there is no difference. I mean, you can measure minus, plus, minus for undirected graph, but they all come out the same.
Right, but for direct you can have four graphs like this. Then.
Yeah, in the paper there are 4 graphs, but this is... so the dots are sized as the size of the network. So what you can see is that there are a few small networks here which are actually kind of on the diagonal. This correlates Pearson and Kendall, but the large ones are all sitting on 0. So Pearson correlation of all these networks is killed by the size effect, and the Kendall goes from 0 to 0.4. But the large networks are all stationed here. So if you take very large network, the size effect tending to 0 everything is very, very strong. Okay, because we should expect something like this. It happens for a few small networks, but all the large ones are here. It's completely killed the assortativity of the network by the size effect.
It also looks like there is almost nothing below 0 for Pearson, right?
Yeah, okay. Good point. This is what we expect. So size effect tells you that it's always positive or 0, and it's very, very large tends to 0. So negativity is basically only through Kendall'S DAO. When I was saying you should see some unassortativity for -1, you see it only with Kendall'S DAO. You cannot see disassortativity, sorry. You don't see disassortativity with Spearman because the size effect on large networks, here we're talking about a few billion edges, and the largest one, I think, it's 50 million nodes.
And what happens, but you can rewire the networks to drive them in a negative Pearson regime. So what happens? You can change the net. You mean on purpose? That's a good point. I didn't try that. We can talk about that. No, I'd love to see what happens to Kendall'S DAO when you're...
And I have a slide in which we inject or excise clicks, which is a little bit like that. So we try to move it toward, and the effects are very dramatic. So the other one that is super weird is plus. Well, that looks a little bit better, but this is very weird. So now we have all these very large networks with Pearson sensitivity 1, and Kendall'S DAO is like 0.4. 1 is ridiculous. It's like, how can this happen? And this is the other weird stuff we've seen. And actually for this, there is unfortunate explanation that is the title knit effect. So I'll take one of these and I will disassemble the experimental data. Okay, so this is a little bit real. So this is the Indochina is a crawl of Indochina, of the countries. At that point, we were working with the language observatory in Japan, and they were asking us to do crawls of Southeast Asia. So we have these crawls like Indonesia okay, so it's a 75 million node, 200 million arcs, and this is the values of the various, the values of the Pearson and Kendall correlation for plus plus, minus minus plus, minus minus plus minus. Now, notice that minus plus is almost 1, okay? Now, what we suspected is that this is a completely fake value driven by some title knit community. So we found the densest small subgraph, which is actually this H1 is 7,000 nodes, so it's ridiculously small, but it has a very high density because it's a gallery of images all pointing to each other. You take it away, 0.36. You take away the second largest, which is a little bit 0.20. So again, we are perturbating a network with almost 8 million nodes by removing a couple of galleries totaling 10,000 nodes, and at Pearson assortativity goes from 1 to 0.20.
And you're saying that that's also 41% of all links, right?
No, density inside those nodes. So this should be, this would be completely dense. It would be 8 million nodes. It's just half of that.
Right.
This is almost a click.
But what I mean to say is, yeah, okay, that makes sense. But then the question is, what proportion of links within the entire network are those clicks?
Oh, these links, well, it's 200 million arcs, and these are like,
60 million.
1,000 times 10,000.
That would be
50 million nodes.
7,000 nodes.
That's actually half of it or something, right?
Yeah. So in other words, if the reason why it might substantially.
Yeah, of course. The point is that the density is very high, and that would be, the arcs would be like 8,000 would be 60 million.
So
48 million.
Right.
Okay. No. Actually, yeah, this contains a very enormous number of links, but the point is that the nodes are very few.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's pathological up to a point because there are a large number of links. But what I'm saying is that if you look instead at the Kendall'S tau, this is infinitely less driven by this very tightly knit.
Right. I mean, it gets to what your focus is. Is your focus going to be on the links or on the nodes? In some sense, if you care more about what the links tell us, then Pearson is doing exactly what it's supposed to.
Right. Yeah. I would say that, but also I think that the point is that we have dirty data. This is not intentional. This is the crawler getting caught in a very small site, which had a lot of links, and data is dirty.
Right.
And my point is that maybe you won't like Kendall'S assortativity, but if you find values like this, at least try it.
Yeah.
Because if you get a wildly different value, you have a very clear indication that there is something happening at the level of a TKC effect. So even if you might not, you say, Newman assortativity is fine, I want links, it's traditional and so on. If you get very close to 0 or close to one value and you don't understand why, my suggestion is compute Kendall'S assortativity instead. Because if you get a wildly different value, this is a strong indication that something is happening either on the size effect or on the TKC effect.
Right.
Okay? Because, this is very large. And, there are for instance, the only way we can see finally some this assortativity minus, which we expect, is to go through Kendall, because this is killed to 0 by the size effect, and as you go here, it gets here, but by the TKC effect. So the numbers you see here are mostly driven by one or the other.
Yeah, that seems reasonable. On the other hand, I might argue that also shows the sensitivity of Kendall'S tau when looking at negative was in degree, or I'm sorry.
Which, sorry?
Negative.
This was in degree, yes.
Yeah. So in some sense, I worry that might also represent the sensitivity of Kendall'S tau. When you see Pearson correlation does not substantially change between G and G minus H12, while you see Kendall'S tau goes from assortative to very disassortative, or relatively disassortative.
Oh, you mean here?
Yeah.
Yes, but Okay, true. But again, it's not that Kendall's assortativity is not affected by size or
True.
is less affected.
But in that case, it sounds like it's more affected.
So does this argue actually for?
Well, it's a kind of balance in the sense that this will be driven anyway. So okay, one effect tends to move it to one, the other one moves it towards a zero. So depending on the network, these two effects. But what I'm trying to convince you about is that, like in the right part, instead of eliminating clicks, we plant clicks. Okay, and you can see that if you plant a click large enough, even Pearson assortativity will be driven to very high value, even if this is fairly small. And the point is that you would like to see this. Because, at some point, we want to measure that reflect our intuition. So in the web, you expect that people with few links, not so important sites, which are the vast majority, will point a lot to important links, to important sites, which have a high in degree. So maybe not -1, but you would expect to see some disassortativity. And with Pearson, in all the samples, you get 0 or even a slightly assortative, which is strange. I agree with you that the point is that here you have an enormous number of links. So this is what is driving, if you want. But consider also that in this case, this is a real example, but from the previous example, you need something much smaller than this. This is not the square root over the root over the 4. Okay, this is like more or less. This is more the square root of the size of the graph. So, of course, this is the example we had. We can make out an artificial example using the limit, and then it would not be a fourth of the link, but it would be an infinitesimal fraction of the link of the whole network. So, this specific example, I agree, has a lot of links, but the analytical example is infinitely less link. It's a small O of the size of the network. Once again, I'm not, as I said at the start, I'm not proposing solutions. I'm trying to raise awareness. Okay.
But solutions to what? Is there any problem phenomena networks that depends on the global value of assortativity?
Okay. Nobody builds power plants using assortativity. Okay, or nuclear power plants. No plane has ever flown with assortativity. It's a quantitative measure that expresses. We use, like many stuff in network theory, is a kind of qualitative measure. The point is that if you want to make a qualitative claim on the network based on this measure, what we suggest is try at least Kendall, or if you want Pearson, Spearman's raw, but you should try at least one measure based on rank, because if the result is very similar, okay, you didn't learn anything, but there is a huge gap. You must analytically look at the network and maybe look for super dense subgraphs or stuff like that to see whether you're being driven by one of these effects, like look at the degree distribution and so on. There is no ready-made solution because, as he was saying, it also depends on where you're more interested in a kind of local notion in which nodes are important or arcs are important. So Kendall'S is somewhere in between. It's not completely local because still there is some TKC and some size effect, but enormously reduced with respect to Spearman raw, to Pearson's correlation. So in my personal opinion, it is more balanced somehow. Well, I said this talk would be short and it's becoming incredibly long. I'm so sorry. So conclusion, this is less influence. So as I said, probably you should try it. If you're really interested in the value, if it's important to you, at least try it, because I think it's interesting. It might give you a hint that you have to look into the network for noise or stuff that is driving the score in a very strong direction. We have code for Kendall'S assortativity in the law library, but only up to 2 billion arcs, because the problem is that you need 128-bit arithmetics to do Kendall tau with more than 2 billion arcs. So we'll write it in C++ at some point, because you have because when you do concordances and discordances, of course, it's squared of this. So if you have more than this, you need 120-bit arithmetics, which in Java is a no-go. You can try, but it's deadly slow. So at some point, we will write a C++ version that does that 128-bit arithmetic. And of course, it's an M log M with 120-bit arithmetic. So yes, it's less influence, but it comes with a cost. Pearson's correlation is just a linear scan of the arcs, and you're done. Thank you.
10 minutes for questions.
Yeah. Can I start out with that's fascinating. I love how you can take one simple concept and talk about an hour for it. But what about? I wanted to bring up other measures of the Taylor. There's this really strange measure that really only saw one paper on it from the guy, friendship paradox guy. Yes, thank you. Inversity. It's been doing Pearson correlation between inverses of the degrees connected by that. And he was arguing in the paper that it's not, it's on
okay.
It's kind of represents local version. It's a local version of
so of course the ranks will be identical because if you yes, well that's I never heard of it, so I'm just thinking now.
I only heard of it because I heard him give a talk at the Sunbelt on it, and that's it. It wasn't even published. Did manage to find the tech report.
So of course, if you do the inversion and you do Kendall'S time, you get exactly the same result without inversion because when you do the ranks. So
I was hoping it might give you more.
No, but the number but if you do Kendall'S. On the verse, but the number you get for Pearson correlation, yes, could be very different, because at that point you wouldn't have the cubic effect. I mean, very large degrees would not be in the wrong place and take down the whole thing. So. Yeah, we should try that. We will certainly try that for the final version of the paper. We'll try that.
Another question
Very good suggestion.
Okay.
Very good suggestion.
Another question I have: this assortativity measures degree correlations, especially in directed networks along the edge. Is there a notion for measuring correlation between degrees of a node?
Yeah, there are a few notions of a local assortativity. I mean, because people have found problem. There are a few papers about local assortativity, try to give local measures that do not depend on the whole network.
No, but this is for degree, correlate between out degree and in degree of an individual node.
Okay.
You can think of it as zeroth order.
Yeah. No, I never. Well, given how many people publish in the area, I think someone must have tried, but I never heard of it. So that would be like, an order zero, like knowing whether nodes with a high in degree have a high out degree too.
That's right.
Yeah, or vice versa.
I mean, that's just struck me right now. But actually, I will tell you over lunch or something. I'll tell you actually this notion, this measure figures in our paper about friendship paradoxes, actually the perception bias in directed networks.
Yeah.
So somehow maybe it's worth making that a specific measure.
Yeah, no. Of course the links are no more involved, so it doesn't really depend on the structure of the graph, only on the degree distributions. Not really on degree distribution, on the degree list, but not on how they are arranged around the arc. So probably more than assortativity would be something like self-assortativity or
self-assortative.
There are measures that are based on the degree sequence.
On the
degree sequence.
Well, like the TK series but that one is like the zeroth order is the average degree. The first order, 1K is the degree distribution, 2K is assortativity, and so forth. But not for directed networks. I don't think there is. For directed, this would be for directed network version with.
Lots of interesting questions. Now
exactly. Very simple.
Yeah.
Question.
Okay. Thank you again.
Thank you
for listening.
And I think that if you want to sign up to meet with Sebastiano in the afternoon, there are still a few slots. Please send an email to Peter.
Was there troppo corto, parlato 50 minuti.
Good time. I'm not going to be in tomorrow, so if you want to meet, we should meet today, like at 3 o'clock or so.
Okay, I was going to meet with Andre, so maybe we can meet
together.
Okay.
Ho le più domande da darvi.